Former Brazilian President Lula da Silva is set to become the new president of Brazil beginning on New Year's Day. He defeated incumbent President Jair Bolsonaro by a small margin in the runoff vote. This will be his third term after his previous tenure between 2003 and 2010. Lula's comeback has cemented a trend across Latin America of a rise in leftist governments, including in Mexico, Argentina, and Colombia. What has propelled the return of Lula? Why is Latin America tilting left? What could be the regional, even international implications? I'm pleased to be joined from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, by Michaels de Paiva, former Brazilian ambassador to China, now member of the advisory boards of both the Brazilian Center of International Relations and China-Brazil Business Council, and here in Beijing by Professor Huo Zhengxin at the China University of Political Science and Law. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So, Ambassador de Paiva, let me go to you first. Brazil's GDP actually dropped by some 40% since 2011, despite a small spike in 2017. Now, 1 in 6 urbanites live in ghettos in 2018. That's according to the World Bank, and some 700,000 people reportedly died of COVID-19, which is the second highest in the world. Is that the context of Lula's victory, and what does his victory, what does his election mean for the country?
It's a pleasure to be here. Hello, Liu Xin. Hello, the audience. Well, there are many ways to explain why Lula is coming back to government. One, we have a divided country, as you expressed, as you mentioned in the beginning. The margin was very small. But there was a certain fatigue of Bolsonaro's government in a certain way. And this fatigue had mainly to do with a number of points. First, his attitude to deal with COVID-19. The second thing is some of his ideas, like the support to the sales of arms and weapons, and the idea that the Brazilians have to protect themselves, you see, instead of having a public sector protecting Brazilians. And the third point is too much emphasis on behavioral aspects, much less than policy decisions that are needed in Brazil. I think these are the main factors that contributed to Lula's victory. Besides, you have Lula's past. He was a big leader in the past. He dealt with the poorest in Brazil in a very efficient way. So people remember that. And that's why they re-elected Lula.
Professor Huo, what does it mean for China-Brazil relations? We're all big developing countries and both members of the BRICS, and we've also always had a strong and steady relationship. So what will Lula's win mean for bilateral ties?
Well, I have to say that this is really a fiercely contested runoff election. Lula wins the election, I think, basically because the Brazilian people want change. And from the outside world, especially from the perspective of China, I do hope that the relationship between the two countries can be strengthened in the future. Because if you look back at the period between 2003 and 2011, when Lula was the president of Brazil, he, regard China as one of the major partners of the country. And he was very active in strengthening the relationship between China and Brazilian countries. And he is very active in promote relationship on the framework such as the BRICS. So I'm optimistic about the future between the relationship between the two countries.
Ambassador de Paiva, your take on the impact of Lula's win on China-Brazil relations. I remember when Mr. Bolsonaro was elected, people had worries about China-Brazil ties, including me on this show. If you remember, when he was elected, I had you on the show, and you actually reassured based on your personal observation at that time, that there was not going to be significant shift in Brazil's policy with China, especially on trade. Now, looking back, what's your assessment of the past few years in terms of bilateral trade and economic development, and what to look forward ahead?
Well, my assessment is that despite the inadequate language used by Bolsonaro and some of his followers about the relations with China, things went very well. Trade numbers reached a peak last year with trade flows at $137 billion. This is really something new. Secondly, if I'm not mistaken, in 2021, Brazil was the largest recipient of Chinese ODI. This means that the investments continue to flow. The third point is that Chinese companies continue to operate in Brazil, and I think the best case is the case of Huawei, who is now an important participant and an important in our economy, and continues to be a major provider of equipment to the telecommunications sector and operate in a number of new areas. And finally, the two countries were able to reach an agreement about two plans, a 5-year plan and a 10-year plan, looking towards the future. However, there was not an environment of strong confidence built about the future. And I think that with Lula, this environment is going to be there. First of all, because Lula is going to be a strong supporter of multilateralism, rules-based international order, and no power politics, and this is very important. The second thing is that Lula is going to be a strong supporter of climate change negotiations and climate change measures in Brazil. Brazil has been accused of not paying too much attention to this, and Brazil was a leader before. This is a new area where we can cooperate. Then you have the cooperation on technology, a number of areas where we can do better.
Looking at Latin America as a whole, as I mentioned in the earlier program, Professor Huo, we know that 8 major regional countries have elected left or center-left leaders and governments. They include Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, Honduras, Chile, and now Brazil. And the last time this happened was between late 1990s to the early 2000s. And not to mention that these are all the biggest countries in the region, either in terms of population or in terms of GDP. So what does this latest trend tell us about the region, Professor Huo? And what do you think are the driving forces behind this change?
Well, from my perspective, during the past years, the world is suffering from the COVID-19, from the uncertain situations in different parts of the world. So the Latin American countries, they want a more balanced and independent foreign policy. They need, I think that economy development means that they need globalization. So I think that this kind of trend suggests that the Latin American governments, they want to keep a more independent and balanced diplomatic relationship with the outside world.
Some analysts, Marcos, point to the United States treating Latin American countries as its backyard, and they say that is one of the main reasons, at least, why the region is having had enough, is seeking independence in terms of their foreign policy. What is your view?
No, my view is that Latin America has a high degree of independence vis-a-vis the United States. The new factor with Lula's administration in Latin America is that Brazil was distant from Latin America, because you saw a number of leftist governments pop up in Latin America, starting a new vision of their own countries, and Brazil, with an extreme rightist government, was distant from Latin America. Now we are going to be closer to the other countries. We are going to participate more in the negotiations in the region. And this is a very important point. And I think that the Latin Americans will continue to make every possible effort to have independent positions on every international issue.
How do you look at the turn to the left in general, Ambassador? Do you see that as a trend, or is just a coincidence of different things happening at the same time? Is there such a trend in your eyes, and what are possibly some of the economic reasons driving this?
I think there's a trend. And it's not so much with the economic reasons, but also with the attitude of the rightist governments towards a number of topics. Societies don't want to live with this kind of indication, with this kind of direction. The other point is inequality in Latin America. This inequality is very strong, and there's a feeling that the leftist governments are better prepared to deal with inequality in the region.
Professor Huo, Lula told Chinese media last year that the U.S. dominated the global economy during his previous term in office, interfered in Brazil's politics, even celebrated his arrest, and Brazil has the right to make independent decisions. But how will he, in reality, conduct his foreign policy this time in office as U.S.-China relations have grown much more tense?
I think that there is a lot of challenge before Lula. However, as an experienced politician, I believe that he has the capacity to judge the international situation. As I mentioned just now, Brazilian countries, they are also suffering from the COVID-19 economic stagnation. So Brazil and China, we need each other. Our economies are complementary to each other. So I think as a major country in Latin America, Lula has the opportunities and also the capacities to deal with Chinese relationship independently. So I'm optimistic about the future between the two countries under his leadership.
And finally, Mr. Ambassador, China just concluded the 20th CPC National Congress with Xi Jinping re-elected as General Secretary for another 5 years. And the largest population in Latin America, which is Brazil, now is to be led by a leftist government. We're both part of the BRICS. So for emerging and developing countries, what would the next 5 years mean?
Well, there's a lot of space for cooperation between China and Brazil, and a lot of space for cooperation with other developing countries. I think one of the main topics that Brazil and China has always defended in international relations is cooperation for development. And this is very important. And at a time when developing countries are in a much more uncomfortable position than in the past because of COVID and because of the distance to the larger and mature economies. So I think this is an area where there's a lot of space to cooperate. And I hope that China and Brazil will be able to make a difference in this area.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Marcos de Paiva, former Brazilian ambassador to China, and Professor Huo Zhengxin from the China University of Political Science and Law. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, I spoke with former Egyptian Prime Minister Essam Sharaf. He explains that Western media accusing China of discriminating its minorities is media warfare. We'll find out why after the break.